My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. Today, I want to talk about why do codependent people have so much difficulty changing. So that's going to be the main topic. But I also think this is a very controversial subject because codependency in itself, there is not actually an agreed upon definition. And of the people who do speak about codependency, I've heard a lot of things such as I've been diagnosed with codependency. And I see this a lot on blogs. I see it a lot on YouTube channels. Some people make their whole living off of YouTube channels that do nothing but talk about codependency. And I'm like, well, let's get to the beginning of this. Like, you can't be diagnosed with codependency. It's not in the DSM. So let's call it what it is, okay? Codependency is a real thing, but you can't be diagnosed with it. So let's start with that. And when we talk about codependency over and over again, what we hear is that it's a problem when a person, they probably have low self-esteem, they have difficulty with being assertive, and they also have a difficulty with self-love. In other words, they don't love themselves enough. They don't care about themselves enough to draw boundaries. And I definitely agree with that. There's a lot of truth to that, and for sure, 100%. But let's be honest about psychology. It's a soft science. It's not a hard science. So there's a lot of wiggle room here. And what I've noticed is that we're leaving out a very large part of supposedly the codependency problem. And we're not going to solve anything if we're not looking at it. So this is the other thing I would like to look at today, is if you look at codependency traits, and you put those up against the traits of highly successful people or people who are trying to reach their full potential in life, what you're going to find is that there is an incredible overlap between the two. And that's something that I really want to point out today, that I just don't think enough people are talking about it. And as a matter of fact, I can't prove anything because, again, soft science, but there's a big correlation between people who have a very high self-esteem and also being codependent. And again, very important to look at. So let's take it from the top. Again, codependency does not have one agreed upon definition, but let's give it a try and let's see what we have. So let's start with this. Codependency, being overly responsible for the well-being of another person, even at the expense of themselves. A codependent person, we can call them a relationship addict. They hold a relationship together, and holding a relationship together actually becomes more important than if both people in that relationship are actually happy. And this causes a lot of pain on both sides, where both people are unable to end the relationship. And what happens is that a codependent person, they tend to allow a lot of negative or even sometimes abusive things to happen to them at the expense of trying to hold this relationship together. So obviously these types of traits are not going to be what I would call healthy. I just want to take a more in-depth look at what codependency is. So let's take a look at codependency traits more specifically. Number one, they're overly responsible for others' feelings and emotions, overly responsible for the success of the relationship. They tend to be very self-sacrificial. They suppress their own needs. They suppress their own emotions to keep the peace. Now, when we're looking at this too, here comes one issue right at the top. Most men that I know, and I know there's different ages and all that, we can talk about that. If you're more of an old school guy, you know, things are a little bit different than if you're a millennial. I understand that. But for the most part, we can say that most men are brought up with the thought to suppress feelings and emotions and to do the job, whatever needs to be done, in order to get the job done for the other people around them. By definition, men are brought up to be codependent. And of course, we know that women also have this issue. But I can say that men, without a doubt, are brought up to be white knights, to take care of people, and to be heroes. And in order to do that, you're already suppressing feelings and emotions. So again, let's just call that what it is. Codependent people are also people pleasers. They tend to give even if it hurts. And again, this is because they want to attempt to increase their value as a person. They're looking for approval. They tend to deny problems. They focus on the positives. And again, we're going to go over this later, but successful people also have a tendency to do the same thing. Codependents tend to be perfectionists. Again, they're trying to increase their value. The more they can increase their value and be more and more perfect, they're beyond reproach, or at least they feel or they think that they might be. They tend to be beyond criticism. And the more perfect they try to make themselves out to be, the less chance they have of being rejected or abandoned. Again, we're going to go over this later, but keep in mind that most successful people also have the same type of value. Codependents are overly loyal to the relationship rather than just themselves. And then we could have the discussion of individualism versus collectivism. Now, this being overly loyal to the relationship also brings forth a thought that I have of when we say for better or for worse that are in marriage vows. Now again, if we go back in history through virtues and values and vows, what you'll see is that relationships come first, the community comes first over the individual. And this is why sometimes codependency is also controversial, because the term for better or for worse now, or since 1986 when Melody Beattie wrote this book, has become a very negative thing to stand by somebody when they're going through difficulty. Again, I'm not telling anybody out there how to think. If you don't want to stand by somebody, that's you can do that. I'm not telling you not to do that. Codependent people have difficulty tolerating other people's negative emotions, and they're afraid to disappoint other people. They also have a fear of failure, fear of rejection, and as we spoke a little bit before, they try to be perfectionists because they fear people abandoning them. And they don't fully hold other people accountable for their behaviors. Why do they do this? It's because they're looking for approval themselves, and they don't want to rock the boat to hurt other people because that might end the relationship, because not everybody, when they are held accountable to their actions, do anything about it. So they end up maybe not doing it. And again, they try to rise above that by making up for somebody else's weaknesses. So they take it on as an extra burden to themselves. So again, the question becomes, is low self-esteem, lack of self-love, or assertiveness at the root cause of being codependent? Well, number one, no. Trauma is the root cause of codependency. So let's start with that. Now, how do we react to that? Well, again, so what I want to do here is, let's take a look at the traits of very successful people and people trying to reach their full potential and see how it overlaps with the traits that I gave you for codependency. And I wrote these down just so I don't miss them, because there's actually too many to mention. But let's start with this. They have pride in working harder for something than other people do. So again, you're in a relationship, things are not going well, so they take pride in working hard. This is what successful people do in learning skills or being good at anything, especially good athletes, musicians, you name it. They tend to be self-reliant. They have an attitude of the buck stops here approach. They have what I would call a responsibility on steroids. They're willing to take the responsibility for other people. They hold themselves responsible for improving the performance of the other people around them. Now again, in modern psychology, this is a negative, and I can definitely understand why. But again, if you're the type of person that's take responsibility for everybody around you, and you put it on you to raise the performance level of everybody around you, we can say that that's negative, because it definitely is. It's a hard way to live. But everybody in all the sports Hall of Fames have the same exact attitude. If you were only a great player, but you didn't raise the level of everybody around you, you would be a great player, but you would not be in the Hall of Fame. So again, if you come from a background that has you with no life experiences, and you just read a book on codependency, you're going to think only one way. I'm here to have you think a different way. If you come from a sporting background, or a background where people value skills or even musicianship type of things, this doesn't make sense, because you should raise everybody else around you. You know, that's one of the reasons why we're here, is to raise other people up. More traits of successful people. Willpower. Consistent, focused effort to reach a goal without giving up, no matter what. Also a good definition of codependence, right? Patience. The ability to put up with failures. Again, bordering on a definition of codependence. Optimism. They see reality but choose optimism as a success strategy. And as noted before, codependents tend to deny the negatives and then they just focus on the positives. And I think that the underlying feeling of a codependent is hope. They always have this hope that somebody's going to get better. You know, they always have this hope that if they had a problem, which they do because we all have problems, that somebody would have their back as well. So I think the overall arching emotion of a codependent, or at least one of them, is hope for a better future. They tend to be givers. Here's a quote from Zig Ziglar. If you help enough people to get what they want, you will get what you want. Which again is a nice definition of codependency, also a definition of people pleasing, by the way. Also the definition of love, it's a verb. Love is not a feeling, it's about what you do, it's about what you give. So again, we see a lot of overlap here. Perseverance in successful people, because quitting is worse than death to a lot of successful people, especially the ones that I know. Interesting. Successful people focus on other people's needs, sometimes at the expense of their own. They do what needs to be done despite how they feel. They suppress their own needs and emotions to reach a higher goal. They're humble enough to accept only half the credit, but they take full blame. And here you go, more definition of codependency, but also the bottom line traits of almost every successful person. And again, as successful people, they tend to be perfectionists. They want to see things done right. If they want something right, they do it themselves, and they take responsibility for it, even over the other people around them. Again, not saying that that's a good way to go through life, but I'm saying this is why it's so difficult for a codependent sometimes to change. It's because all these traits are the same traits that they've used to become successful people. So it brings it back again. High self-esteem. Let's take a look at that. High self-esteem. They believe that they can win friends and influence people, and they believe that they can achieve personal goals no matter what the odds are. People who feel like that have high self-esteem, not low self-esteem. So that puts a dent in all this whole codependency, low self-esteem culture. Successful people have fear of failure, and that is a driving force among almost every single successful person I've ever known. So when we say codependent people have a fear of failure, fear of rejection, so does every successful person. So if you've made that your superpower to like, I'm gonna feed off of this fear of failure and I'm afraid to walk away and quit, that's gonna be a problem in an abusive relationship, or in a relationship where someone's an addict and you actually can't help them. It actually borders on narcissism in a sense, to think that you have that power to change somebody when you can't. Here are just some phrases and some thoughts that I've had that also suggest codependence that many people seem to look up to. Stand by your man, never say die, leave no man behind, all for one, one for all. We all need someone to lean on, and if you want to, you can lean on me. You know, and stand by me is another one I'm thinking here. So, I mean, there's so many of them that lead us to believe that it's okay to falter and have somebody try to help you through it. Successful people also tend to, many times, not always, but they tend to act out of obligation and duty rather than pleasure. And that's a trait of every successful person, as well as many codependents. Like, for example, tomorrow morning I have to get up at 3:30 to go to work. It's not pleasurable to do that, but in 30 years worth of work, I've never missed that time, and I'll never sleep through it, no matter how tired I am. Doesn't matter. I've got an obligation, I've got a job, I've got a duty to do, and I will do it. It's not about pleasure by sitting in bed all morning long. It doesn't happen like that. So if you're that regimented, you have a good chance of being codependent, as do doctors, nurses, teachers, and everybody else in the helping fields. So I hope what I did today is show you, again, I'm not telling you how to think or what to do, but there's a lot of difficulty with people changing their codependent behaviors, especially if those behaviors and traits are used for them to be successful. And I don't think that this discussion would be complete if I did have a little talk about Melody Beattie, who is like on the Mount Rushmore of psychology when it comes to codependence, because she didn't coin the term, but she certainly popularized it. Here's the book, Codependence No More. There's her name. I want you to take a look at this, because this is very important. Almost everything you hear about codependence is based on Melody Beattie's writing. What is Melody Beattie's writing based off of? How much evidence? There is none. The reason why I had you take a look at her name, do you see any letters here other than her name? You don't. And here's why. She's not a psychiatrist. She's not a psychologist. She's not a therapist. Her own self-description, she's an ex-heroin addict, an addict of other drugs, and an alcoholic. She's a self-help author now because her book got popular. In 1986, which was the me generation, it's only about me. Stop caring about other people. And again, so this has very little background in any type of psychological science. It's an addict who wrote a book. And let me tell you some of her words. Let's go over it a little bit. One of the most important things, if you want to help anybody, whether you're a therapist or not, is to have understanding, empathy, and compassion. Because whether you're a codependent or not a codependent, or if you're in a real bad relationship and you should leave, that person's in pain. There's no need to make fun of them. There's no need to put them down. There's no need for any of that. If somebody's an addict, they're in pain. If somebody's trying to help that addict and they're in a relationship with them, they're also in pain. They all deserve understanding, empathy, and compassion. Let's see how much Melody Beattie has. She writes, codependents, they're hostile, controlling, manipulative, indirect, guilt-producing, difficult to communicate with, generally disagreeable, sometimes downright hateful. They were a hindrance to my compulsion to get high. This is the expert. There's more. The codependents in my life don't understand me, and the misunderstanding was mutual. I didn't understand me, and I didn't understand them. This is very disturbing for a leader in psychology, and I'll tell you why. She doesn't understand why when people are in a relationship, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your child, whether it's your mother or father, she doesn't understand why these people's loved ones would be in pain, or they would try to stop somebody from being an alcoholic or a drug addict or have other issues. She doesn't understand why people would stand by people who are having difficulty in their life. As human beings, we're all social creatures. We're designed that way. Typically, when somebody we love is hurting, we tend to show empathy and compassion for them. We have the leader of a psychology movement that literally says within the first page of her book, she doesn't understand that. And yet she's a multi-millionaire off of this book that has some good points, but the general part of it makes no sense. Let's continue with this because I find this really interesting. Page 5. I saw people who had gotten so absorbed in other people's problems that they didn't have time to identify or solve their own. And it goes on. Listen, if there's somebody in your life that's killing themselves, if there's somebody that's ruining their life, if it's your son or your daughter that has a drug problem, it doesn't mean that you have so much low self-esteem you can't handle your own issues. Your child is your issue. Like, what, are you kidding me? Like, it makes no sense. It's the same thing when you're married to somebody and they're going through a tough time and they're going through all this difficulty. And it's like you're paying attention to them because you can't handle your own issues. Listen, we all have issues. Got that. But the thought that you shouldn't spend time trying to help a loved one with their issues is flat out insane. And it's only written by a person that has no background other than being a heroin addict. Sorry. That's the real truth of it. And I get it. Sometimes it's overboard, right? And we can't enable people. That's ridiculous. And sometimes if people are abusive, or probably all the time, actually, I should have said that. If people are abusive, if they're an addict and they don't want the help that you're trying to give them, absolutely. You know, you can't stay in that relationship and it's time to move on. I get that. But this bottom line thing of when anybody gets in trouble, you need to be out that door. Or if you have empathy or compassion for your loved ones, that you have an issue. She actually goes on to say that the people who are trying to help the addicts have more issues than the addicts themselves, which is, listen, they all have issues, right? But there's really no need for the derogatory language. There's no need to be putting people down. I don't think that's healthy in any way, shape, or form. I hope you found this valuable. Again, not telling you what to think, but just to give you something to think about. Because successful people have most of these traits. And it might be time that if we want to solve this problem, that we look at the whole problem. We don't just look at the couple of issues that Melody Beattie brought up, and she has no psychological background. I hope today was valuable for you. If you'd like, please hit the like button and get a few people to subscribe. I can use that. Thank you very much. I'll be back next time.